So why do we want agents that plan? Well, think about it. You're building an agent. Let's say you have an agent like the one from last time that's trying to get an apple off of a tree. Well, you could write down code that says, if detect apple, then move towards apple, right? And this could be a Pac-Man playing agent where you say, if next to dot, eat dot, if near ghost, run away from ghost. And if you try to write down a simple function which maps directly from what you observe to what you do, it turns out that you can make bad decisions. Okay, it's very hard to write these agents, and then they do something crazy, right? You move towards the apple, and it turns out moving towards the apple is not such a bad rule of thumb, right? You know, in general, that's how you get apples. In some contexts, it's a bad idea, okay? And in order to know it's a bad idea, you either have to write a ridiculously complex function that says, if apple and not cliff and blah, 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 then jump, okay? Or what you can do is instead have a much more simple and elegant system which considers that that's a bad idea, considers the alternative, and comes to the conclusion that some other plan that may be more complex, it may take several steps to achieve your goals, still achieves them in a better way. So we'd like to be able to write agents like the one on the right that plan ahead and are therefore able to do the contextually appropriate action where you don't have to write down the very complicated relationship between the context and the action. Instead, that should come out of your model. Okay? So the key idea here. So on one hand, the first kind of agent where you just write basically if-then statements, where you say, if you see this, do this, that's technically called a reflex agent. Okay? A reflex agent is an agent whose action is chosen based on the current percept, so you see the apple, or you see the dot, or you see the ghost, and based on what you're perceiving right now, you basically have some kind of lookup table, and you do your thing, right? There's a direct and relatively simple in the sense of computation, mapping between inputs and actions. Now, it could be complex, and that lookup table could be very, very big. Okay, reflex agents are entirely allowed to have memory or a model of the world's current state. So there may be things you can't see, and you're keeping track of what you've done in the past. You can have state and still be a reflex agent. Reflex agents refer to the fact that you don't consider the future consequence of your actions. Instead, you only consider how the world is right now. And how the world is may relate to your memory, but you don't consider the future. So there's this question, can a reflex agent actually be a rational agent? Why are we even talking about these things? Aside from the fact that if you just sat down before this class to write an agent function, you'd probably write a reflex agent. Well, let's see some demos. Here is a reflex agent for the game of Pac-Man. Its program is, if you are next to a dot, eat it, or more generally, move towards the closest dot. Okay, now if I execute it, it will, in a beautiful, rational way, clear the board, right? You can think ahead all you like. You still got to go around the circle and eat all the dots in basically that way. So in this case, reflex can be rational. It can also have problems. So let's take a look at a reflex agent in a slightly more complex environment. All right, so it's going towards the closest dot until now. Okay, so what happened? What went wrong here? Well, what went wrong here is, in order to step towards the closest dot, you choose the action east. That turns out to not be very effective. Once you take the action east, you're back where you started, and you do it all over again, okay? This is kind of classic reflex agent shenanigans. So, reflex agents. We love them. Okay, back to the question of can they be rational? Of course they can be rational. Rationality is a function of the actions you take, not the computation that led to them. So if you had a big enough, good enough lookup table, and you're taking the right actions, rationality doesn't care what thought process led to them. Okay. Reflex is a comment on the thought process. On the other side, you have planning agents, which, by the way, could fail to be rational depending on how they work. A planning agent, unlike a reflex agent, asks what if. Okay. In order to make its decisions, it thinks about what the consequences of its actions will be. Now, of course, one way to find out the consequences of your actions is to do them, to execute them in the real world. We'll come back to this point much later when we talk about reinforcement learning. But right now, a planning agent does not actually figure out the consequences of its actions by doing them. It doesn't realize that it's going to fall off the cliff by jumping off the cliff. Instead, it computes the consequences in simulation, in a model. So in order to have a planning agent, you must have a model of the world. And instead of trying things in the world and seeing their consequences, you try them in the model and find out their consequences. Now that, of course, means that you have to formulate a model. And then you also have to formulate a notion of what you're trying to achieve within that model, and that's going to be called your goal, or in general, it'll be a goal test, because there may be a lot of ways the world could be that you'd be happy with. Like you might want an apple, but you don't care which apple. The hallmark of a planning agent is that it considers how the world would be if it did a certain thing. Some ideas that are important here are the distinction between optimal and complete planning. A complete planning agent finds a solution, finds a way of achieving its goals. An optimal agent instead not only finds a way to achieve its goals, but also finds the best way according to some cost function. So we'll constantly be talking in this lecture and the next about the distinction between being able to find a solution versus being able to find the best one. Two different criteria. In addition, a planning agent can either be kind of an entire planning agent that comes up with an entire plan and then executes it, or comes up with mini plans one after the other. The agent that comes up with mini plans and continues to replan is called a replanning agent. Let me show you the distinction between these. All right, so here's a configuration. Again, this is the one where the Reflex agent got stuck. Remember, it got stuck in the upper left-hand corner. And this is going to be a replanning agent. So it finds a path to a dot, doesn't care which one, and then it executes that plan, at which point it will have eaten at least one dot. And then it repeats that. So it's going to do a bunch of plans to get a dot after a dot after a dot. And as a result, let's see what it does. You can see at the bottom, actually, it's a thought process flashing by. It's doing search after search after search. And, you know, maybe not the most efficient way, but sooner or later it gets all of the dots. Okay, and lightning fast. Here's a different agent. Okay, this is the mastermind agent. This is Mastermind Pac-Man. This agent does not kind of just come up with a mini plan and then go off. It sits and it thinks, and it thinks and it thinks and it thinks, and it finds the best way to clear all of the dots. Its goal is not getting one step closer to clearing the board. Its goal is to clear the entire board in an evil genius kind of way. So let's see what it does. Well, the most important thing it does is it thinks. So it's setting up its thinking. It's not even thinking yet. Okay, now it's thinking. It's doing something. We're going to find out today what it's doing. It's still doing it. Okay, and what it's doing is search. And so it's expanding a lot of nodes, thousands of nodes. It's thinking very, very deep thoughts because this is in fact a tricky problem. And it's still thinking, but now, when it finishes thinking, behold the evil genius. Not a millisecond of waste. It knows to end with the dead end, so it doesn't have to backtrack. Brilliant.